This is Otmar Arnold from Tenna, Switzerland, in a presentation for PPR 491D, Week 6, on how or why pacifism and peace activism might be controversial within some forms of Quakerism. Peace emerged very early on in the nascent Quaker movement as one of the key testimonies defining Quakerism. It has never been a core dogmatic or programmatic issue. The apocalypse and the second coming of Christ, and with it questions of salvation and the personal and corporate comportment in everyday life, so to speak, heaven on earth, occupied the minds of early friends. The earliest reference to a particular peace testimony was made public by Margaret Fell for pragmatic reasons. She tried to avoid the dire consequences on members of the movement from political and cultural implications of the resistance against the new light, or in other words expressed, the prosecution through the state and the church. She tried to reassure the worldly authorities that Quakerism was not a militant scheme trying to overthrow the existing powers with the use of weapons. Quote, that it is our principle, life and practice to live peaceably with all men and not to act anything against the king nor the peace of the nation, but to be obedient to all just and lawful commands. Margaret Fell to Prince Charles, or King Charles, in 1660. Theologically, a peaceful attitude as a core Quaker expression was eventually rationally justified. Robert Barclay, who wrote the 1675 Apology, and Elizabeth Bathurst in her Truth's Vindication in 1679, argue in their respective ways that peace and peaceful demeanor are indeed theologically sound, based on the Christian heritage in biblical writings, the example of the primitive church, and the transformational experiences made by early friends. In essence, a human being at peace, who believes that every human is created in the image of God, and who is at peace with him or herself, has no need to use violence against other human beings or corporate bodies. This attitude also requires the belief that in God's kingdom on earth, worldly matters would be organized according to God's will, thus no need to employ violent means to further political ends. What evolved from this position was an explicit commitment to social justice and political reform. In the 18th century, this was the theological foundation for the Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania. However, many dilemmas emerged between theory and praxis. Eventually, Friends had to discern between the sovereignty of their state and the perceived military threats by the French and indigenous forces. Even later, the dilemma that was created during the abolition debate was the use of force against the Southern Confederate States in order to free the slaves. History shows that it was often the simple friend who suffered in these instances, because they remained steadfast with their commitment to biblical peace without maneuvering in the fields of political or economic pragmatism. Some lost their livelihood at the hands of Quaker officials for maintaining their firm belief and its consequent prophetic expression in this world. Here, I see the parallels to the controversy explained in Stephen Angal's talk on the tensions and crises among American Quakers in the times of the Vietnam War. Many people in the Indiana meeting seem to have been influenced by the political climate of the Cold War, anti-communist rhetoric, and conspiracy theories. Their pragmatic response was to stand up and defend their hard-earned livelihoods and long-standing church traditions, which of course are discourses of privilege. Their peace concerns were diverted to questions of corporate membership in the World Council of Churches. Others discerned on the basis of principle, thus opposing further engagement of the US in the Vietnam War. I'm not aware of the theological reasoning that occurred in these discussions. However, in contemporary times, it seems sufficient to employ the Quaker peace testimony to justify conscientious objection to military service or the use of violence. It is the form that is essence. In the absence of corporately discerned and unifying Quaker theology, or even the thought of needing such an option, I would argue that in liberal Quakerism, the openness to pluralism and the absolute perhaps can lead to repeat controversies on the expression of Quaker faith, the traditional peace testimony included. Even more so, as the Quaker community is now a spread out diaspora in an increasingly secularized world, working more like a civil society organization with a specialization on peace and social justice issues, with a unique form of doing business than a remnant of the true church. Liberal ideals, human rights and freedoms, ethical considerations and choices makes friends good citizens, quote, obedient to all just and lawful commands, with the option to do acts of civil disobedience. The absolute perhaps, as postulated by Dandelion, characterizing contemporary liberal Quakerism, creates a foundation for uncertainty and openness to many influences. It also removes the possibility of prophetic action. Therefore, pragmatic discernment based on the private and corporate fears that are a reaction to dominant discourses seem most appropriate. Friends go and demonstrate against arms trade show without further discerning that these industrial interests are at the core of the political, social and economic privileges and securities they individually cherish in Western societies. Another example, value-based ethical consumption is sufficient to satisfy the conscience, despite the documented and palpable growing inequality between the rich and the poor, based on the basic principles of consumerist economies. So, contemporary liberal friends do not seem at peace with themselves based on transformational experiences and the imminent eschaton, as early friends sought to be, but are focusing on social action in pragmatic segments of their choosing. Belief is marginal, as we have heard in this week's lectures. However, there is so much that seems taken for granted, as for instance illustrated by Dandelion's excursus on inclusiveness in film 1 of week 6, that could constitute unspoken faith matters or dogma of contemporary Quakerism. Friends are again in a situation like 18th century friends in Pennsylvania, who were faced with the choice of war or a partial acceptance of abolition. Contemporary pluralism advocates for choice, and friends become stuck to choose among the lesser evils in absence of an absolute position on peace based on belief. This creates the unique narrative of one branch of Quakerism today, and its sometimes controversial expression of the testimony of many pieces. Thank you.